Just insulting, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it
Because
is.
it's just, how can you make out that these people are just so idiotic that they don't understand these laws, and therefore that's why they're acting this way? That you would see 12 million people take to the streets just from a lack of education and a lack of understanding about a law. Firstly, one of the reasons that we're covering this, just for anyone wondering, because this isn't specifically a Sikh issue. It's an issue that affects all farmers, so there's people of all backgrounds and all statuses across India, and they are very much involved in the protest. But this, by its very nature, impacts the Sikh community greatly, because farming, agriculture is something which is kind of entwined within the Sikh society and the motherland of Punjab, the motherland of Sikhi. So it's something that's very important for us to cover. And from our perspective as reporters, as journalists, when you see a mass mobilization, I think the last kind of estimates were 12 million protesters are currently out there in the streets of India on their way to Delhi, or protesting somewhere in some kind. It's something that we have to cover. And the farmers are saying that these laws are going to leave them open to exploitation. And therefore, that's something that kind of we definitely need to cover, and need to ensure that kind of we put out the message that these farmers, what they see is a very real path towards basically their bankruptcy and their lands being taken away. And that is kind of a huge issue that could leave Sikhs in a Sikh farmers in a state which is, just, you can't even imagine it. And obviously they already had many issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's a human rights issue. We all know about the suicide rate amongst farmers. For several years now, there's been hundreds of farmers every year committing suicide because of laws and regulation that has been introduced by the government. A lot of this has been GM crops, like GM companies such as Monsanto, providing seeds which overpromised and underdelivered. They promised to generate huge yields with very kind of hardy crops that will, survive throughout difficult temperatures and different terrains. But in reality, actually, what it's ended up doing is destroying a lot of crops, and also causing illnesses like cancer. Monsanto, we've mentioned, in California, they've been forced to pay out $10.9 billion because of their products, their pesticides especially, causing cancer. And this is what's been going on in Punjab for several years now. It's very much it's another human rights violation of Sikhs in Punjab, to add to the many that we already report on. And we can even see from the image as well that human rights violations extended to, violence, a man in riot gear beating elderly farmers. These are 70, 80-year-old men. It's it's frankly quite disgusting. And it has no place in a modern society, especially a country even that calls itself the largest democracy in the world.
So hopefully all of our followers can see that, as an organization which works for the Sikh Panth, this is something that we have had to cover. And again, it's just to kind of reiterate on some of those points. It's the protests that we're seeing currently taking place are very much a culmination of various issues that have now come to a head with these new laws that have been implemented. I think they were first pushed through in March, and they were ratified in September. And now, the farmers are kind of in a state where this is life or death for them. So that's why they've taken to the streets en masse. And as we saw in the image previous, they've faced just violence. And that's, with no surprise, sadly, when it comes to dealing with the Indian state, they face great violence. They've been beaten by police. They've faced tear gas. They've faced water cannons. But yet they've kind of marched through all of this with that typical Sikh Chardi Kala attitude to go and, do what they said they were going to do.
Yeah, and the threat to their livelihoods is very real. There's these huge organizations, these monopolies, they stand to really hold the farmers to ransom for their crops, because they've got huge cold storage facilities where they can hoard their crops, and they can just hold on to them until the farmers' crops are, coming to their expiry date, their use-by date, and then, force the farmers to lower their prices, or even just not buy them and just let those crops die, and those farmers then go bankrupt. And then when they're bankrupt, then they haven't got any power to be able to hold on to their land. They'll just have their land seized. And the end game that I think the farmers and the rest of the Sikh community is concerned about is this being some sort of corporate stroke government takeover of land, from the Sikhs, from the Punjabis essentially, and from the farmers to the state.
And again, there is kind of a pattern here that we've seen internationally in other countries like the USA, for example, where there have been similar kind of moves made, and essentially that has ended the to a large extent anyway, the life of the little farmer, the individual that kind of just survives off their own land without any need for kind of connection with the corporations. And looking at this image that we have here now, I think it'd be a good point to talk about the way the media have covered this. And firstly, regarding this image, what we've heard a lot about the protests is that they are violent. They're, even in the West, I've seen articles by The Independent, by the New York Times, calling the farmers, the protesters, angry. And from my perspective, a lot of the kind of imagery that is being painted here is to portray them as a mob that are, just out for, I guess, power or, whatever meets their agenda. Whereas in reality, what we're seeing is, again, farmers that are really desperately fighting for their livelihood. But as they're doing it, we're seeing them in typical Sikh fashion also live up to Sikh principles.
Yeah, I mean, the Saki of Bike Energy being, inspiration for this as well. That image reminds me of that is, many of us will be familiar with the Saki of Bike Energy, who was a Sikh at the time of Guru Gobind Singh Ji Maharaj, who would serve water and tend to the enemy soldiers that had fallen as well. It's a similar principle. There's no hate amongst Sikh, in a Gurmat mindset. We don't have hate. We just have, this intolerance for injustice.
If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, share and subscribe. Please donate and help spread Guruji's message. Link is in the description below. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.